Hello everyone, my name is Rohan and welcome to my channel. In today's video, we will discuss an important topic from Indian art history titled The Making of Indian Modernism, History, Perspective and Contribution of F.N. Suja and M.F. Hussain. So, Indian modernism emerged as a response to colonial academic art as well as to the need for a new visual language after independence. So in this video, we will look at how Indian modernism developed historically and key idea that shaped it, and how artists like F.N. Suja and M.F. Hussain played a crucial role in redefining modern art in India. So this discussion is especially useful for uh, all kind of visual art student or art history student, and the topic will be explained in a clear exam oriented way. So let's begin. So objective of presentation is to understand the evolution of modernism in India and its connection to nation building uh, in the time period of 1920 to 1980. So, and it also explained to examine the forces shaping Indian modernism, including nationalist tradition, Western influences, and elite discourse, and the exclusion of subaltern vices. And it also recognized key contribution focusing on F.N. Suja and Hussain role in shaping India's modernist vocabulary. So in this slide we will discuss about introduction of Indian modernism. So modernism, modernity and modernization and modern are closely tied to Western history. Uh, for non-Western nation, especially since the 19th century, becoming modern meant imitating Western social, economical, political and cultural models. So the idea that some nation reach modernity earlier and other later, it's created hierarchies. This lead to the label likes Indian modernism, African modernism, and Mexican modernism. So Indian modernism is belated, hybrid, and shaped by anti-colonial context, formed through negotiation between Western form and post-colonial identity. So avant-garde movement challenge colonial and institutional norms defined by imitation, adaptation, and resistance rather than copying European styles. So according to Geeta Kapoor in When Was Modernism? Essay on Contemporary Culture Practice, argue that Indian modernism was not just aesthetic style but a historical condition tied to India's modernization, industrialization, and post-colonial nation building. So shaping of Indian modernism की बात करें तो Indian modernism emerged through the interaction of Western ideas and Indian tradition during colonial rules. Unlike the West, Indian modernism focused on cultural and spiritual reform rather than industrialization. So, spiritual and cultural reform movements such as Theosophist movement inspired artists toward spiritual evolution and universal harmony. Key figures include Sri Aurobindo, Jiddu Krishnamurti, Ramanna Maharshi, and Annie Besant. So social and religious reform movements played a major role, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy Brahmo Samaj promoted rationality and women education. Swami Dayanand Saraswati Arya Samaj emphasized monotheism and national awakening, and Devendranath Tagore further modernized these ideas with rational reinterpretations of Hindu texts. And the Swadeshi movement encouraged Indian artists to reject Western academic realism and revive Indian traditional style, supported by thinkers like Ananda Kumar Swami and the Japanese philosopher Okakura Kokujo brought with him the idea of Pan-Asianism, a belief in cultural unity among Asian nations to resist Western imperialism. So European modernism entered in India through the 1922 Bauhaus exhibition in Calcutta, exposing artists to abstract, non-realistic style by Paul Klee, Vasily Kandinsky, and others. So फेजेस ऑफ इंडियन मॉडर्निज्म की बात करें तो फर्स्ट इज़ द प्री इंडिपेंडेंस फेज़, जिसमें रिवाइवलिस्ट फेज़ आता है जो लेट 19 अर्ली 20th सेंचुरी का था। एंड नेक्स्ट इज़ कॉन्टेक्चुअल मॉडर्निज्म 1920 टू 1940। तो कॉन्टेक्चुअल मॉडर्निज्म में क्या था कि शांतिनिकेतन के कलाकारों ने वेस्टर्न मॉडर्निज्म एंड प्योर हिस्टोरिकल रिवाइवलिज्म दोनों का विरोध किया एंड डेवलप्ड ए कॉन्टेक्स्ट सेंसिटिव मॉडल which rooted in Indian lived realities. And Tagore ने वाल्टर गोपियस को लेटर लिखा that India has a living craft tradition, so it should not jump blindly into industrial modernity. So the post-independence वाले फेज में नेहरूवियन एरा नेशन बिल्डिंग एंड कॉस्मोपॉलिटन मॉडर्निज्म की बात की जाती है. And one thing is very important that Tagore opposed inhuman Western industrialization in art. That's why he appointed Nandalal Bose, which rooted in Indian craft ethos instead of Avaninath for the Santiniketan. So if we talk about uh, according to different art historian, definition of modernism. So Partha Mittar connect Indian modernism with the primitivism. He argued that the modernism is an imported European concept. So modernism entered India in 1922 with the Bauhaus exhibition in Calcutta. This is according to Partha Mittar. And Tagore expanded the artistic vision at Santiniketan, bringing modern international ideas. Stella Kramerich invited in 1919 at Kala Bhavan to teach art history, and W.G. Archer criticized Gaganen Nath, saying his modernist style felt irrelevant, and Archer dismissed his work as a rebellion against the Bengal school, calling it failed modernism. And the Geeta Kapoor said that modernism developed separately from the West in a fragmented timeline. So modernism in India spread through visual art, cinema, theater and performance, not just पेंटिंग. इसके अलावा गीता कपूर नेहरूवियन और गांधीयन मॉडर्निज्म की भी बात करती हैं. सो नेहरूवियन मॉडर्निज्म से मॉडर्नाइजेशन थ्रू द टेक्नोलॉजी एंड इंस्टीट्यूशन लाइक मॉडर्निस्ट आर्किटेक्चर, जिसमें नेहरूवियन टाइम पीरियड में इस तरीके के काम पर ज़्यादा फोकस किया गया. एंड गांधीयन मॉडर्निज्म के बारे में लिखती हैं कि मॉडर्निटी थ्रू एथिक्स, community and the moral transformation like handicraft, khadi, village industries and folk art. So Indian modernism is deeply social, historical and post-colonial, not only formal or aesthetic. So it is negotiation between the nationalism and selfhood. So dialogue defining Indian modernism की बात करें तो Indian modernism emerged through intense between debates between Western influence and indigenous traditions, between revivalism and experimentation, shaping a unique artistic trajectory. So the debate between Anglistics, those who supported Western art and education, and Orientalists, those who valued Indian art tradition, was not just racial but intellectual. For example, Vinay Sarkar, an Indian intellectual, supported European modernism as the true form of progress. So, in his essay "The Futurism of Young Asia," published in 1922, he criticized the Bengal school of art for being conservative and anti-modern. Sorry. So, conversely, E.B. Havel, an English art educator, believed that true modern Indian art could only emerge from Indian tradition. He collaborated closely with Rabindranath Tagore to revive classical Indian aesthetic, which called revivalist phase. So during the late colonial period, the Bengal School of Art, led by Abanindranath Tagore, represented a nationalist modernism. It rejected Western realism and sought inspiration from Mughal miniatures, Ajanta murals, and Japanese vase technique. While this movement was anti-colonial and spiritual, but it was still modern in its ideological search for an authentic Indian identity in art. So it led by figures like E.V. Hevel, Anand Kumar Swamy, and Avanindranath Tagore in the late colonial period. So it emerged through India's encounter with the Western art, colonial modernity and debates on Orientalism versus nationalism. So it sought to construct a distinct spiritual and culturally rooted Indian visual identity. So these are three examples of revivalist phase painting. First is Bharat Mata by Avanindra Tagore, second is Ras Leela by Kshitindranath Majumdar, and third is The Extinguished Flame by Abdur Rahman Chuktai, 1920. These are all in vast technique and based on uh, nationalist modernism or revivalist phase. So, in the next slide, critiques such as W.G. Archer described Indian modernism as an offshoot of European modernism and argued that realism was imposed through colonial art education. Same way, the Partha discussed that modernism is an important European concept. उसी तरह से W.G. आर्चर भी इस बारे में बात करते हैं. So the Bengali art journal Rupam first discussed Indian modernism, noting that it did not emerge organically but developed in response to colonial influences. So Yashodhara Dalmia, an art historian and author, argue that the discourse of modernism in India filled with the complex projection and the contradiction that are difficult to fully understand. Yet, she suggests that even if modernism had not naturally developed in the India, it would have been created because it had become a cultural necessity. So, इनके अकॉर्डिंग ये बहुत इम्पॉर्टेंट बात थी कि अगर इंडिया में मॉडर्निज्म डेवलप नहीं हुआ होता तो इसका आविष्कार करना पड़ता. And Sodra Dalmia also talk about that when Charles Gerard became the next principal of JJ School of Art in 1936, the concepts of modernism were introduced in art. जिन्होंने JJ School of Art में modern art technique like impasto, knife painting, post impressionist and expressionist concept को introduce कराया. So Gerard supports some student जिन्होंने यंग टर्क ग्रुप बनाया जो कुछ हद तक फेल भी हो गया, जिसमें पीटी रेड्डी, एमटी भोपले, ए मजीद, एम वाई कुलकर्णी ये आर्टिस्ट थे, बट उनके काम में मॉडर्निज्म का साइन लाइक ब्रश स्ट्रोक, सबलाइम कलर ये सब देखने को मिलता है. सो शांति निकेतन और कॉन्टेक्चुअल मॉडर्निज्म, एज वी अर्लियर डिस्कस्ड about the contextual modernism in short way. So here early modernism or contextual modernism is developed by artists at Santiniketan such as Rabindranath Tagore, Nandalal Bose, Vinod Bihari Mukherjee and Ram Kinkar Baij. So art historian R. Shiv Kumar, in his curatorial essay Shantiniketan, The Making of a Contextual Modernism, National Gallery of Modern Art in 1997, argued that the artists of Shantiniketan developed a form of critical modernism by harmonizing indigenous tradition with cosmopolitan experimentation. This was neither a mere imitation of Western academic art nor a nationalist revivalism like the Bengali school. So, Santiniketan artists inspired by the Gandhi's emphasis on craft, Tagore humanism, and the Bauhaus idea of integrating art with life, adopting them to the cultural and ecological context of Bengal. So, artists rooted modernism in local everyday life, folk tradition, and rural experience, creating a socially engaged, regionally grounded visual language. So Gemini Roy drew from folk traditions, while Amrita Shergill expressive realism and modern womanhood expanded Indian modernism or modernist identity, making her as pioneering and iconic figure. So these are four example, uh, starting three from Santiniketan school or contextual modernism. So first is Nandlal Bose Haripura posters painting series, and second is Gaganin Nath cubistic landscape, and third is sculpture of Santhal family by Ram Kinkar Badge, and fourth is the bright toilet oil on canvas by Amrita Shergill. So Nandlal Bose is deeply rooted with the Swadeshi Swaraj movement and nationalist movement, and Ram Kinkar introduced post-Cubist, peasant-centric dynamic modernism, and Jamini Roy merged folk idiom with modernist vision. So Nehruvian era modernism and Indian modernism की बात करें तो state support like Lalit Kala Academy promoted in modern art and sparked debate between tradition and modernity. Critique like Richard Bartholomew, Mulk Anand and Jaya Swami helped shape and promote modernist idea. So the Keku Gandhi, an artist and art collectors played a pivotal role in promoting modern Indian art form from the 1940. He funded Camol Frames 1941, showcasing young artists like K.H. Ara, S.H. Raja, K.K. Hebbar, and M.F. Hussain. So Indian modernism engaged with the social and political realities, unlike Western modernism, which emphasized individual expression. So artists adopt modernist style to address nationalist theme like partition, nation building, and India's cultural historical context. So about the cosmopolitan modernism, by the 1940, younger artists such as F.N. Suja, M.F. Hussain, S.S. Raja, and Tayyab Mehta, later known as member of Progressive Artist Group PAG or PAG, rebelled against the sentimental nationalism of the Bengal school. So other artists collective like the Calcutta PAG, Delhi Shilpi Chakra, and 1960 Shiban artists group helped define Indian modernism. So, realistic themes related to religion, sexuality, poverty, and urban alienation focused on urban modernity, post war politics, fragmented human condition, and Indian social realities were explored. So, Indian modernism became hybrid, a combination of the Western technique and Indian themes. Artists used to expressive power of European modernism but rooted their works in Indian social realities. So the hybridization reflect what scholars like Partha Mitra and Geeta Kapoor describe as the cosmopolitan modernism, as an art practice negotiating between the metropolitan and Western and modernism and local Indian cultural identity. So the progressive artist group at the first exhibition. This is the photograph of the first exhibitions of progressive artist group. M.F. Hussain, F.N. Suja, S.K. Bakre, K.H. Ara, and S.H. Raja and H.A. Gade are there. So the overall, the progressive group was established on the eve of independence. They rejecting academic realism and the Bengal revivalism and create international modernism. So the first case study on the F.N. Suja. So there are one powerful quotation by F.N. Suja that we are bold and full of fire. We were forging a modern Indian art with a blast. So F.N. Suja, pioneer of Indian modernism, funding member and key theorist of the progressive artist group. He rejected academic realism and the colonial morality in art, and he introduced a bold modern visual idioms to post-colonial India. And he also used painting as a critique of religious hypocrisy, class identity, and the social representation. So this picture is F.N. Suja working in his studio. F.N. Suja was born in 1924 and died in 2002. Sorry. So in the next slide, we will talk about the style and technique of F.N. Suja artwork. So this is the Untitled Landscape of 1962, oil on paper, uh, laid on board. So very much expressionist, linear and anti-naturalistic and deeply psychological, and thick black outline and contorted bodies and intense emotional colors use distortion, irony, and symbolism to question power and moral authority, and created a new romantic Western style influenced with the Indian social and the political content. So themes and iconography की बात करें तो एफ एन सूजा के आर्टवर्क में क्राइस्ट, क्रूसिफिक्सन, न्यूड, अर्बन पॉवर्टी, वायलेंस, सेक्सुअलिटी जैसे थीम्स रिप्रेजेंट हैं. So his works from the early 1950 explored controversial themes, in particular religion and sex, which, according to the writer and art critic Yasodhara Dalmia, would turn into uneasy companions. So blended European modernism with the Indian sensuality and moral critique. His art visualized post-colonial anxiety through visceral emotion and sometimes violent and sometimes erotic. So the first image is Francis Newton Susan Untitled Separate Emmas in 1994. So Christ and crucifix, Christ symbols, इसमें exaggerated figures और bold brush stroke का representation है. Next is crucifixion. So Christ shown as tortured, bleeding in the grotesque, not divine or idealized. So critique of church hypocrisy and the colonial Catholic trauma and suffering, and rash lines, angular bodies, and aggressive stroke express existential pain को represent करते हैं. So the next image is lovers in the park, oil and wood, very much expressionist and bold brush strokes. So the influence and legacy developed an anti-colonial modernism that questioned social order rather than merely depicting it, opened pathway for radical individualistic art beyond nationalism or traditions, remains central to discussion on identity, sexuality, faith, and dissent in Indian modernism. So according to John Verger, Souza's style was deliberately eclectic, essentially expressionist in characters, but also drawing on the post-war art brut movement and element of British New Romanticism. So F.N. Souza with S.H. Raza and Akbar Padamsee in Paris in 1925 in exhibition. And next, in the next slide, there are three paintings of F.N. Souza. First is Mithuna and second is Self-Portrait 1949 oil on board, and third is Nude. So he used mixed erotic nude imagery with the Christian iconography and symbolized conflict between the desire and the religious moral codes. So confrontationally anti-bourgeoisie confident line drawing to express bodily truth. So in the self-portrait, he represent himself as anti-hero, outsiders, rebel, and sinner rather than glorified artist. He rejected ego. He reflected ego, insecurity, ambition, and the inner conflict, often fragmented and masked, like symbolizing fractured identity. And very thick black and bold outlines and earthly palette, exaggerated facial feature, and decorative symbols. So next is Separate Emmas with the Believer and the Spectic in 1958 oil on canvas, and next is Birth painting by Pensuja, and next is entitled Woman and Mirror in 1952, and next is entitled Signed and Dated by Suja in 1958. So next is entitled Lithograph on Paper. So the bird figure is very thick outlines and distorted body, aggressive brush stroke, and fragmented cubist-like form merge with the tribal and Byzantine icons like faces, hybrid aesthetic. Nude figures symbolize fertility, biological inevitability, not sensuality. Male figures imply social control, patriarchal gaze. So this is the style of F.N. Suja and his artwork. So there are three landscape by F. N. Suja, which is very cubistic and expressionist. So one is house monotype on paper, and next two is untitled landscape in 1963 oil on board. So he painted in very much expressionist and cubist visual language. So ये एफ एन सूजा की पेंटिंग थी. नेक्स्ट आर्टिस्ट एम एफ हुसैन. So M.F. Hussain was born into a traditional Muslim family and was influenced early by folk performances, street life, cinema, poster, and popular culture, which shaped his art more than formal academic training. So his repeated images such as horse, female figure, mythological characters, crowds, and broken or fragmented bodies reflect his personal emotion, memories, moment, फ्रीडम एंड हिस्टोरिकल अवेयरनेस. सो स्टाइल एंड इन्फ्लुएंस की बात करें तो हुसैन कंबाइंड इंडियन फोक आर्ट, मिनिएचर पेंटिंग एंड टेम्पल इमेजरी with modern Western style like Cubism and Expressionism to create a bold and modern visual language. So, from an art historical perspective, Hussain works mix autobiography, nationalism, and modernism, presenting the artist's self as both personal and representative of post-independence Indian identity. So this is the painting by M.F. Hussain entitled Bharat Mata, uh, which is in acrylic on canvas. So ये बहुत विवादित पेंटिंग रही जिसके कारण इनको देश छोड़ के कतर की नागरिकता को स्वीकार करना पड़ा, क्योंकि इन्होंने इस पेंटिंग में भारत माता को न्यूड रिप्रेजेंट किया था. So next is Gram Yatra painting by M.F. Hussain. So this painting record for Indian auctions matched by $13.7 million. The work sold at Christie, New York, almost quadrupling its $3.5 million highest estimate as South Asian modern art crest a wave. So there are some examples, painting example by M.F. Hussain. So the first is horse, जो M.F. Hussain का पसंदीदा सब्जेक्ट रहा. नेक्स्ट इज मदर ट्रेसा, गंगा एंड जमुना, अनटाइटल, लेडी वेदवीना, ब्लैक हेल, राजस्थानी वुमेन एंड ब्रिटिश राज. सो उन्हें भारत का पिकासो भी कहा जाता है क्योंकि उन्होंने बहुत क्यूबिस्टिक तरीके से अपने सब्जेक्ट को रिप्रेजेंट किया. So in the next slide, I discussed about the modernism and its criticism. So critiquing modernism, western centric framework की वजह से treated as derivative of European modernism, local histories and context overlooked. So next is elite and urban modernism. So it produced within the bourgeoisie metropolitan spaces, folk and tribal visual cultural को exclude कर दिया गया था. And state control modernism एक तरीके से स्टेट कंट्रोल मॉडर्निज्म था. सो नेहरूवियन पॉलिसीज इनकरेज्ड यूनिवर्सल अब्स्ट्रैक्शन, स्टेट इंस्टीट्यूशन सेव्ड डोमिनेंट आर्ट प्रैक्टिसेस एंड सोशली डिस्कनेक्ट था ये तो फ्रॉम प्रायोरिटाइज्ड ओवर सोशल रियलिटीज़, ट्रामा, लेबर एंड लिव्ड एक्सपीरियंस मार्जिनलाइज्ड थे इसमें. सो ignoring caste and margins. So Dalit and Adivasi Vaishyas absent no critical engagement with the caste structures. So कुछ इन कारणों की वजह से कहा जा सकता है कि मॉडर्निज्म, इंडियन मॉडर्निज्म जो था ये ग्राउंड रियलिटी को एक तरीके से नहीं रिप्रेजेंट कर पाया और कुछ हद तक ये फेल्ड भी रहा. सो पोस्ट कॉलोनियल एंड फेमिनिस्ट सबाल्टन पर्सपेक्टिव की बात करें तो Modernism construct binaries: elite versus folk, urban versus rural, modern versus tradition. So women artists, artistic labor and everyday practice remains invisible, and regional, linguistic and minority identities are underrepresented. So lacks representation of ground realities and lived struggle. So in post-colonial and decolonial discourse, Gayatri Spivak critique of representation and subaltern cannot speak helps unpack how subaltern folk visuality were marginalized in elite modernist narratives. So these are example by Jainul Abidin. First is Bangladesh Liberation War of 1971 and next is Famine of Bengal 1943. Uh, जिसको इन्होंने प्रिंट मेकिंग और वुड कट में रिप्रेजेंट किया था. सो कंक्लूजन से पहले कुछ इम्पोर्टेंट मॉडर्निज्म में पॉइंट थे, जैसे मल्टीपल फतवे की बात करें तो जिन्होंने इंडियन मॉडर्निज्म को लीड किया तो लाइक सत्यजीत रे, ऋत्विक घटक brought modernism in Indian cinema, and the Indian People Theatre Association यानी IPTA, which is found in 1943, unite artists and use theatre, music and street play to support freedom struggle and raise awareness about issue like Bengal famine and create a national cultural awakening. So Progressive Writers Association PWA, which is founded in 1935. प्रेसिडेंट वाज प्रेमचंद्र, जिसने लिटरेचर में इंडियन मॉडर्निज्म को प्रमोट किया, जिन्होंने सोशल इनजस्टिस एंड इम्पीरियलिज्म के खिलाफ फाइट किया. अपार्ट फ्रॉम दिस, if we talk about architectural modernism, so Indian architecture plus western architecture के कॉम्बिनेशन को नेहरूवियन मॉडर्निज्म में रिप्रेजेंट किया गया. आर्किटेक्ट लाइक चार्ल्स कोरिया, राज रेवल्स, एडविन लुटियंस एंड ली कार्बूजियर, जिन्होंने इंडिया में आर्किटेक्चर के थ्रू मॉडर्निज्म को प्रमोट किया. सो कंक्लूजन की बात करें तो इंडियन मॉडर्निज्म रिप्रेजेंट ए कॉम्प्लेक्स एंड मल्टी लेयर्ड आर्टिस्टिक शिफ्ट दैट reconfigured the relationship between tradition, modernity, and national identity in 20th century. So Indian modernism is more self-conscious and reflective than Western modernism because it contains constantly negotiate with its colonial and post-colonial contradictions. So modernism in a way of relating to the material and the cultural world in a period of unprecedented change, which we call the process of modernization. So non-Indian modernist theories offer a critical framework for understanding Indian modernism not as a derivative art movement but as an effective reworking of global modernity. So Indian modernism was syncretic, secular, revolutionary, a bridge between East and West. So Indian artists absorbed, translated, and resisted Western theories, transforming Greenbergian formalism into spiritual abstraction, Baudelairian urbanism into post-colonial alienation, and the Marxist social history into a visual language of national self-definition. So Indian modernism therefore should be seen as more modernist, not less, because of its self-awareness about history, development, and inequality. So ये ओवरऑल इंडियन मॉडर्निज्म के बारे में था. So these are bibliography. So ये कुछ बहुत अच्छी बुक्स हैं जो इंडियन मॉडर्निज्म के को अच्छे से कवर करती हैं, जिसको आप लोग पढ़ सकते हो. थैंक यू.